In the previous installment, our hero named Seun was a fat kid until a scary grandfather dragged him to another world and told him the story that Seun is a yokai, a goblin. Our hero was immediately transformed into a pumped-up guy and began to destroy all comers until he came face to face with the enemy, which was not to his teeth. He was saved by a powerful shaman who turned out to be his best friend. In the same parking lot that night, his friend dropped his mask and began to approach Seun. He didn't understand how this happened. Looking at his body, he could see that Seun had gotten a pretty good beating. He was also puzzled as to how Seun had managed to last so long against this monster. To which Seong replied to him in a hoarse voice that he should let it wait for a while, because it was very hard for him to breathe. His friend realized that this poison was not ordinary, but magical, and the drugs from the pharmacy would not help. They could not do that. Talking could wait, but there was a more important problem: to save his friend, because he didn't know that Shion was a yokai. He knew he wouldn't last much longer, but in a moment the veins in his neck and all over his body began to go away. He also couldn't understand how it happened, as if the poison had simply stopped working. Putting it down to natural regeneration, he calmed down a bit, but it was a mystery to him. As soon as he heard a foreign rustle, he immediately shifted his gaze to the side. The yokai, the snake he had wounded, started to crawl away from them. They were slowing down a lot, so he was able to recover and run away from them. His friend realized that this was a very memorable night for him. Once outside, Sion asked if his friend was okay. He replied that he was fine, but he was very puzzled and thoughtful. After all, he had missed a yokai, and the man he had been friends with for the past 3 years was a half-blood yokai, and what was more, a half-blood goblin. His friend was very puzzled by this news, because for 3 whole years, right in front of his nose, there was a yokai, and he didn't even know about it. His father would have ridiculed him for such a thing. Shion began to ask about his friend's house. After all, he had never told him what kind of training they were doing there. He held his head up and answered him that it was his family's duty to train and exterminate supernatural beings. That's why he spent so much time training. He also mentioned the fact that there were only 7 months left. Xiong immediately realized that his friend knew about the festival. He inquired about how often the yokai came to the human world and harmed them. His friend told him that it didn't happen very often before. If they were just fighting amongst themselves, it wouldn't bother him. But unfortunately, they had made several attempts on human lives in the last 100 years. Recently, however, the course of things had changed drastically. Seun was immediately curious, so recent was it. A friend told him the information that for the yokai, humans are the real dope. Those who want to become the new king are willing to cross the line. Now, they don't just absorb some of a person's energy, they devour them whole. A month ago, the number of missing people began to skyrocket, especially in densely populated areas. There was no direct proof of the yokai's involvement, but in most cases, homes were partially destroyed and covered in blood. But for the first time in his memory, a yokai had shown up in person. He stopped his speech and grabbed his weapon. Shion didn't realize what had come over him at that moment. But behind him, someone immediately landed very hard and addressed Seun. In front of him was Seol Mi, who was very worried about Xiong and immediately asked if he was all right and if someone had injured him. She apologized to him very much since she had fallen for such a childish trick. Yushin interrupted her, ordering her to talk less and not to dare approach them. He warned her that if she took another step in their direction, he would kill her on the spot. Shiun tried to tell him that this girl, but Yushin interrupted him and continued his line that he was most likely not human, but a yokai, and he assumed that she was fully aware of the concept of following the law. That's why he warned her instead of attacking her right away. He went on to say, "It turns out you basically had no need to warn her if you didn't hint." But then he realized and said, "It's all because of you." You'll be free to visit the human world if you pass the exam, because that's what they told Seun. Yushin called him an idiot and asked if he knew what was meant by that. After all, these creatures are monsters. Even if they resemble humans and have differences in character, their true nature remains the same. Consumed by the lust for power and the taste of blood, they are willing to devour even their own kind. It doesn't matter what's in Seun's blood. He's still human, and this world is his home. He doesn't need to ask permission to be here. They kidnapped him, and now they have the nerve to say he needs to become a monster to come home? It sounded like bullshit. Yushin had promised him that no matter what happened, he wouldn't abandon him. It was quite clear to Seol Mi what he was talking about. From Shiyun's perspective, it was as if he was caught in the center of a future storm, but his name had already been entered into the registry. He is now a resident of the yokai world, and no one's opinion matters. Putting emotions aside and looking at the facts, breaking the rules like this would not end well. Not for Shiyun, not for his shaman friend. She took it upon herself to resolve this issue before it became a problem. She decided to run away with Seun, trying not to hurt anyone, but she wasn't sure if what she had planned would succeed. After all, one look at that shaman's aura, and it was immediately clear how powerful he was. Maybe Seol Hua or Go Yu could do it, but she wouldn't be able to do it. Saying nothing, she decided to move the situation forward. She turned to Yushin, telling him that as much as he didn't want to, she was Shiyun's guardian, and she had to take him with her. Yushin replied to her that since she intended to ignore the warning, to him. At that moment, something changed abruptly. It was Shiyun pointing his foot straight at Yushin's sword, thus putting himself between them. Yushin didn't realize what he was doing. Shiyun instantly reached out and snatched the sword from Yushin. He began to examine it and noticed that the sword looked very interesting. The engraving on it was not simple and must have been specially applied. Yushin thought that Shiyun was being controlled by magic or hypnosis, but then assumed it could be something else. He asked Seun what he was doing or what she was up to. Shiyun replied that about bloodlust, he doesn't have it. But the fact that the yokai devour their own kin, he cannot deny. After all, he had recently eaten one himself. Even though he'd been told the monster had lost the right to be called a yokai, he couldn't tell if it was true or not. But either way, he had killed a living creature to protect himself and his loved ones, and stopping was definitely not in his plans. He didn't plan on hurting people, but he would continue to devour the yokai if it would help him become stronger, even if he has to risk his life to do so. Yushin understood this, but also thought that Shiyun didn't need to go that far. After all, with Yushin, his home, and Seun's home with his mother, would be safe in 6 months. Shiyun let go of his sword, and it stabbed into the ground. After which he said, "I haven't finished yet." Looking at Yushin, he smiled and said that his goal was to become the king of the yokai. To say that Yushin was stunned by his friend's statement is not saying anything. He was in such shock that you can't tell. Seol Mi watched all of this, especially as Yushin started yelling at his friend. He asked if Shiyun had lost his mind. He also asked him if he knew what the king of the yokai was, and what kind of nonsense he was talking about. To which Shiyun smilingly answered him that he would not tell him any details, but he did not know what he was talking about. All he knew was that he had a chance, and he would definitely take it. If he suddenly succeeded, the world would not have to be turned upside down. Xiong asked Yushin not to look at him like that. After all, it looked ridiculous from the outside. Xiong couldn't do anything else in this situation because he might or might not succeed, but in the end, that wasn't what mattered. What was important to him was that he would make his own destiny, not sit around waiting for a predetermined future. He wants to try, and he wasn't afraid of the consequences. When Yushin heard all this, he realized that he could not be persuaded. He noticed that even if he was human, or even a yokai, If his intentions were pure, he didn't need to justify himself to him. But if one day Shiyun crossed the line, he would kill him without hesitation. For Xiun, it was a fair decision. If the need arose, it must be that he would do something truly horrible. Yushin lifted his mask and turned to the girl, asking, "Guardian, what is your name?" She gave her name and said that she was acting as an envoy on the Korean peninsula. Putting on the mask, he apologized for meddling in the internal affairs of the yokai. But he also heard that even the yokai have laws that they must obey and follow. Therefore, if anyone dares to violate them by harming or killing Xian, then he will use the powers of the shaman of the Star Hall, slaughter all those responsible without mercy. Yushin also added that they would see each other again, and about Sion's mother, let him not worry. After that, he left to keep watch over the order of people and monsters. At the same moment, Seol-mi said that she was shaking wildly. She thought they were going to die here. After all, this was the first time she had met a shaman. She also asked Siyun, "Are they all so scary?" To which she got the answer that it was unlikely that they were all like that. In his opinion, Yushin stood out even among them. Seol-mi noticed that the brother who helped her with catching the shadows came after her. He said that he had no other choice. Because he realized what her plan was, having no idea of her opponent's strength, not even knowing the number, to just rush into the thick of things. After all, if her opponent was even slightly stronger, she would simply be eaten for dessert. Afterward, he turned to Siyun with this question, "So you are that half-goblin?" Shiyun said hello to him, and the guy continued talking. Yokai who trace their lineage back to animals are called beast demons. Most of them are tied to the appearance and instincts of their common ancestor. As they grow stronger, they not only gain the ability to reincarnate as humans, but also their true appearance becomes less and less like their ancestor. These yokai, or all members of their family, are called ghost beasts. And a step higher, there are beings who have surpassed their ancestors. In the past, they were called divine beasts. They were once worshipped equally by both humans and yokai. After saying that, he smiled and said that it was a pleasure to meet him. He introduced himself. His name was Goyun. If our hero really wanted to become the king of the yokai, Xion would have to fight him at the festival. Goyun was a member of the Black Turtle clan. He extended his hand to say hello to Xion. Xion extended his hand to him, and he noticed how this person changed in an instant. Seol-mi shouted for Xion not to shake his hand. But he didn't understand what could be the problem here. She turned to Goyun, saying that he is trying to throw it out right after suddenly showing up. After all, Xiong was already having a bad day today. He asked her, "So, what law says I have to sleep all the time?" Besides, the situation was funny. A half-goblin so confidently declaring that he would become the king of the yokai. After shaking hands with one, Goyun bit his finger and then used magic with blood after all. He used a teleportation technique, and together with Shiyun, they traveled to a completely different place. Closer to the open area on the shore of the lake, there was a surge of magic as a teleportation effect. Shiyun tried to steady his legs, for they began to tremble violently. Goyun noticed that our hero was much stronger than he had expected. After the first, also sudden teleportation. Not many people can stay on their feet. Besides, at his opinion, Shiyun wasn't surprised in the least. Shiyun decided not to hesitate, and immediately asked if he wanted to eat it. Goyun answered him that it was most likely the most likely scenario. But before they get started, he had a couple questions for him. Goyun asked if he plays games. He meant computer games. Shiyun was a bit stunned by this question, because he definitely didn't expect such a thing. Our hero answered that he had played games in middle school, but he hadn't played anything since he moved to high school. This was followed by a question about his favorite genre of games, mobs, shooters, MMORPGs. Siyun answered that action RPGs are more to his liking. Online games are not too much to his liking. After all, they constantly feel like the highest bidder wins, not the one whose skills are better. Go-yun didn't even think of arguing with him, because that's just the way it is. But his smile, it was as if he was already planning something. Shun noticed something behind him. There was an explosion where our hero was standing. He had enough reaction to jump back and dodge this attack. After that, he noticed that there was a huge block of ice lying in the lake. He couldn't look at it for long, as many sharp ice shards were already flying towards him. They attacked him, and once again there was a huge explosion. Go-yun liked this kind of comfort. He also noticed that Xion was fast enough to dodge the two attacks. Go-yun realized that Xion was not trying to dodge and escape from his attacks. On the contrary, he was targeting him, waiting for the best moment when he couldn't dodge. Go-yun knew that Xion had firmly decided to himself that he was his target, and he must destroy his target. For a beginner, he is very good. His perception, his talent for battle, they're hard to overestimate. But right now, what shines brightest is his ability to learn. Today, he has already faced the style of combat his opponent is displaying. He keeps his guard up, ready for any danger that may come from his opponent. And his decision that he chose at this moment was the quintessence of all the experience he had gained this day. Xiong directed a blast of his magic and energy towards Go-yun, forming a mighty blow that destroyed everything in its path. The worn armbands on his arm were a treasure of the yokai, releasing the user's power and energy. Shiyun landed and tried to discern if he had succeeded in destroying his opponent, but Go-yun decided to give him another lesson. He decided to let it look like the attack had worked. After all, it was never a good idea to relax early. But Xion decided to deliver another series of blows to that point. He made more attacks. Then he realized that he had sort of figured out how to use the energy, but not completely. The use of the energy made goosebumps run through his body. It originated from his lower abdomen. By his personal senses, there was a little more than a half of it left, about 60% of it. 10% he spent on a huge beam. Then, a few better smaller ones, he estimated it took about 3% each. If he reached 0, he would fall back into the exhaustion state again. Therefore, he couldn't thoughtlessly throw it away. From the smoke, Goyun's voice could be heard saying that his attack was admirable. He didn't think that he would have to summon icicles almost immediately. He wondered if he had underestimated Shun that much. After all, the first stage of the battle was over in a matter of seconds. It was still unclear to Shun, with such a strange way of speech from Go-yun, was he really trying to eat him or not? After all, Shun didn't feel any threat coming from him. Go-jun explained that it was really hard for him to fake bloodlust. He was right. Go-jun had no personal grudge against him, and he wasn't trying to eat him. He was just a little hurt by Shiyun's words. He asked Shiyun if he knew what the king of the yokai was like. Shiyun replied that by his title it seemed clear and obvious. He was the king that ruled the yokai and made laws that they were obliged to follow. Go-yun added that if you think about it, isn't it strange why the election of a new king is reduced to a mere pugilistic fight? And why does it only happen once every 666 years? The being that will rule all the yokai for hundreds of years is elected by a mere festival, where, moreover, anything can happen. The yokai follow this ridiculous tradition because it is their unbreakable covenant that has been passed down from generation to generation. They are creatures that are true to their desires and instincts. The mere fact that a strong man has established his own order in their world is not enough for everyone to blindly follow it. If things were as Siyun imagines, there would be no end to the slaughter and devouring of each other. To avoid this, the ancient yokai created a fail-safe, the king of the yokai. Because of the nature of the yokai, one day they would inevitably fall victim to their own desires. To prevent this outcome, they all agreed that they needed a fail-safe, a being who demands the obedience of all the yuki of the world, who in return ensures their survival. That's what a king of the yuki is. Fortunately, over the millennia, all successive kings have managed to keep the world stable without major incidents. Their policies have differed at times, but the foundation, the survival and prosperity of the yokai, has remained the same, with only one exception: current king. Imagine if human governments one day issued a decree. No human being is allowed to eat meat anymore, no matter the circumstances. What kind of chaos would their world plunge into? There would be a storm of protests. And if the law were repealed, the protests alone wouldn't be the end of it, Xiong suggested. Go-yun added that they've had such a law in place for 666 years. If you put the situation in that perspective, it would make a lot of sense to Shi-yun, how important their king was to the yokai, and what sacrifices they are willing to make to protect this ancient tradition. But now even their patience is wearing thin, if you know what he means. It became clear to Shi-yun that if the next king extended the law, it was unlikely that the yokai would be willing to continue to follow it as they had before. Gaon liked how quickly he grasped things. Even if it were a decree from the king, few would be willing to enforce it. He might be the strongest yokai, the king, however, in the end. If the vast majority oppose his authority, there's little he can do about it. And certainly if it comes to that, it could end up being more than just a containment of the current king. The very need for a king will be called into question. On that day, his power will become only history. Afterward, he asked Si-yun if he now understood what was meant. "I will become the new king of the yokai and extend the law," he quoted Si-yuna, and added that not many in their world would tolerate such a statement. The younger ones would chuckle and go on with their lives, but the old Myeom would tear him apart. Go-yun understood who gave him such false hopes. "She's a good kid, not like the other yokai. The only problem is that she hasn't had time to see the world yet and gets attached to new acquaintances too quickly," Shi-yun asked him, asking him if he was asking him to take his words back. That is exactly what he wanted. At first he thought that Xiong was one of those inept people that he could just crush, but now his opinion of him has improved a bit. After all, he was a fast learner and his fighting potential was not bad. Go-jin has offered to serve him. If he helped him become the king of the yokai, he would allow Xi'an to rule the Korean peninsula. In his opinion, it was a good deal, yes. He wouldn't be able to keep the people from the yokai completely, but his family would certainly be safe. Shi-yun asked, "How strong is Go-yun and what are his chances that he can become the new king?" Go-eung answered him honestly. He wouldn't say he's the strongest in Korea, but there probably won't be any yokai stronger than him at the festival, since there is an age limit for participation. After saying that, Xi'an agreed with him and extended his hand to shake Go-jin's hand. If it would already help protect Xiong's loved ones, he was willing to accept such an offer. Go-yun replied to him that he had not disappointed him. He had made the right choice. Xi'an interrupted him, saying that he wasn't ashamed in the least. Having used his energy and Go-yun's stalemate, he's now caught and won't be able to dodge or cover himself from his attack. Go-yun didn't think it was such a primitive trap. Xi'an kept talking. He said that Go-yun's words were not trustworthy. Besides, he was the first to offer Xi'an a handshake, deceiving him, and immediately attacked. Compared to the strength that Xiong had displayed before, this Shirim was on a completely different level. 60% of the energy he had left. He put every last drop of it into this attack. It wasn't instinct, but a technique that he used consciously for the first time. It was called Sirim Mountain Throw. He had left all doubts behind. Now determination and courage were blazing inside Si-yun. He struck that strongest blow that made the ground rattle and crack. The strongest column of smoke rose up. That blow could be heard for miles around. There was a lot of dust and smoke. It took quite a while to disperse. Xiong sat leaning on his leg. His energy was running out. After all, he had put in a lot of energy. The trembling in his body did not subside. It was because of the overuse of energy, restoring his stamina, healing his wounds. For Xiong, who had put everything he had into the strike, leaving only a drop of energy untouched, these two options would be unavailable for a while. After completely depleting his energy reserve, Jun was no longer able to continue fighting. But he hadn't yet noticed that Go Yun was standing in front of him as if nothing had happened. A part of Go Yun's face was covered in ice. He told Seun to hold back his bloodlust until the last second, and then risk his life by putting all his power into one single attack. It was as if the heavens themselves had blessed him with a talent for fighting. He also spoke of his unique magic called the North Pole. It allows you to manipulate water and freeze it in a certain radius around the user, and it can also be used for offense and defense. If it weren't for the difference in power between the two, Seun would have undoubtedly defeated him and appropriated his energy for himself. Go Yun asked if he would have any last words, but our hero answered him that there would be none. For if he wanted to say anything to anyone before he died, it was certainly not to him. And since he started the fight, ready to kill and devour him, he was also ready for his own death. Besides, according to Seong, they weren't done yet. After all, Seong clearly won't ask for mercy and will go all the way to the end. Go Yun looked closely into Seun's eyes and saw a fire there that only grew brighter and brighter. What was it? An intention to catch the enemy in a mistake and take advantage of his weaknesses? Or perhaps it was the goblin's spirit awakening without his knowledge. Go Yun turned to Seun, saying that he had a lot of eloquence to offer, considering that he could barely stand on his feet right now. Holding out his hand to Seun, he said, "Okay." He patted him on the shoulder and told him that he had passed the test. Seun was puzzled. He didn't understand what it was now and what test he had passed. As Go Yun expected, Seun never disappointed him once until the very end. Enthusiasm surging, it even began to seem natural. Go Yun didn't know whether to cheer for him or not, because there was no point. He had no chance of becoming the king of the yokai. Seun asked him in bewilderment, "What? You were just a moment ago describing why I shouldn't become the king of the yokai." Go Yun confirmed his words and added that it was the truth. Everyone is eagerly waiting for the election of the new king, but he doesn't like the idea of a knight of the yokai. Since his early childhood, he has disliked the noise and commotion of the yokai world. The senseless fights, the killing, the bragging, the attitude of the others as if everything was just the way it should be. He could never understand it. If you compare their world and the human world is a much quieter and peaceful place. Humans, however, also sometimes live in the midst of chaos, but at least here they could choose what they liked best. What Go Yun liked most about the human race was that they could enjoy idleness and idleness. Comic books, games, novels, movies. Such useless things are not to be found in the world of the yokai. But they prefer to devour people in this world. If the world changes so much that people can no longer make them, in his opinion, it will be a real tragedy. Seun noticed the way he spoke, and it meant that there were other yokai who shared his views. He understood what Gojin meant, but he didn't see the point where Gojin should cheer for him. He smiled and replied that he could be the king of the yokai. After all, the Korean peninsula has the highest chance of winning, but there is one very annoying problem hidden in becoming the new king. Guyen said that including him, all the festival favorites come from noble families with rich bloodlines. Their power they inherited from their ancestors. But more importantly, they have techniques optimized and passed down from their ancestors to use ancient magic. Even if two techniques have the same strength, the one who inherited the results of thousands of years of trial and error would inevitably be stronger. He also mentioned the expression he heard in the human world, born with a golden spoon in your mouth. It was the same story here. Seong realized that if one was born into such a clan, it would be like being born as the heir to a very wealthy family. There would be pressure from outside and things like that. Pressure. That's a rather mild description. Goyun would prefer that by training they are driven almost to death. If a kid is born with any talent whatsoever, the whole clan is telling him day and night that he must become the new king of the yokai. No one cares what he wants. When you become a clan member, you swear to put your family's interests first. Or if you don't like it, then they will kill you and elect a new representative. Xiun realized that even though Goyun wasn't human, having the entire family as enemies was extremely cruel. However, said Goyun, pointing his finger at Xiun, you are a different matter altogether. After all, Xiong had a weighty lineage and possessed serious talent. He is not bound by the ties of family or clan. He even has the motive and desire to become king. He can become the new king. No, he must become one. It was deep in the night. Xiong asked not to be so quick to give him so much information. He asked for some time to digest what he had heard. After all, things had been happening too suddenly for him lately. Goyun had just started to speak when Seol-mi suddenly appeared and stuck his head into the ground. She was very angry with Goyun, so she tried to cause maximum damage by pressing him as hard as possible to the ground. Xiun was astonished by what he saw, for he thought they were friends. Afterward, she threw him into the distance. On his way, he knocked down a couple trees and stabbed himself into one of them. But that wasn't the end of it. After it landed, Seol-mi used a unique magic called wind feathering. Xiong tried to stop her, but she purposefully decided to do so. After launching many sharp feathers at Goyun, she calmed down. Xiun approached her and looked to see what had happened to Goyun himself. But she said that it was fine, because with such attacks, she wouldn't even scratch him. And knowing him, he must have already disappeared, anticipating the reprimand she was going to give him. Seol-mi warned Xiong that this person he was talking to wasn't the real Goyun. To make a long story short, he had a split personality, the Black Turtle. According to legends, it was born from the union of a snake and a turtle becoming one. However, if you trace their origins, the ancestor turns out to be the most common tortoise. Once upon a time, long ago, a genius recognized the power of yin and yang. Soon he separated them from his inner energy, then divided yin and yang between them, leaving only the purest yin. In this way, he surpassed his own limit, awakening the divine power. Such was the birth of the first black turtle. All of his descendants inherited his power to some extent. But to become a full-fledged black turtle, they had to undergo incredibly painful training. And in something of a side effect for them, they became a snake. The second personality he had seen. Xiong told her that in his opinion, he wasn't a bad guy, though he didn't seem like one at first. Seol-mi replied that there was no malice in him. The only problem is that he does things first and thinks later. He's also extremely impulsive and selfish. And his antics are a real pain in the ass. But at his core, he's a snake of concentrated negative energy. Maybe that's why he's so calm and cold-blooded. He's completely subservient to his real personality, the turtle. In this duo, strategizing and planning should have been on the snake's shoulders. But in the case of Goyun, there was something wrong with his snake from the beginning. For some reason, it could arbitrarily take control of his body, which causes him to get into trouble a lot. For the same reason, there were many disagreements with his candidacy as the clan's representative at the festival. His detractors nicknamed him the Undertaker. He's talented enough for them to settle down already. Afterwards, she asked him if he was going back to the yokai world. She also told him not to worry. After all, it wasn't his fault. Even if someone would be unhappy with their late return, it was no longer his problem. She got a reply from Sion that he didn't care much about it. He was more concerned about the balcony, in his house. He'd been gone for a month as it was. He thought his mom would worry a lot after seeing something like that. They were interrupted by a voice from behind him telling him not to worry about his balcony. It was an old man who promised that tomorrow the house would be back to the way it was. After all, they have workers taking care of such mishaps. He asked Seol-mi to go back first. After all, he needed to talk to Xiun. She immediately started to justify that Xiong had done nothing wrong. After all, it was all because of her mistake, and it wasn't his fault. The old man knew everything. She just shouldn't hear the conversation. After all, the three of them had something to discuss. At first, they didn't realize who the third would be. The old man realized that it was not particularly polite to come to visit so suddenly, but he offered love and pity. Shiyun stared at the third interlocutor who was considering his house, for she had not been in the human world before. Seol Hua looked and assessed that, overall, it wasn't bad. A bit cramped, but furnished tastefully. Shiyun didn't really understand how she managed to get in here, after all. She hadn't gotten permission yet. She said that she had no secret benefactor and that 12-hour visits every 6 months were no good for her. And she wasn't going to come to a world where she had to hide from the eyes of others all the time. She was just dragged here all of a sudden. Looking at the old man, she said he promised to explain everything to her later, so she followed him. So here she is, still waiting for an explanation. The old man first decided to tell what happened last night. Just after sunset, about 50 ghosts appeared in Seoul's Socho district. Someone was controlling them, and they were attacking people. When the yokai went to deal with them, it turned out that the ghosts were acting extremely rudely, not even trying to cover up the crime. The old man thought that this trick was done to distract Seol Mi so that Shiyun would be left alone. Seol Mi interrogated the old man, saying he didn't think it was the original purpose. To which he replied that it wasn't their only goal, because there were about 200 people missing in Seoul this evening. This number is derived from reports sent to the police. The real number of missing persons, however, reaches at least 500. Seol Mi couldn't believe such information. It turns out that there were at least 5 yokai behind this plan, acting in an organized manner. If they tried hard enough to make a list of suspects. The old man confirmed her speculation and said that if they were all Korean residents, it wouldn't be hard to catch them. However, some evidence from the places he had visited leads the old man to some unfortunate thoughts. Many yokai from other regions have come to the Korean peninsula. They know they'll be caught quickly if they do business in their home territory, so they started kidnapping people in Korea, where it's harder to track them down. And if they don't succeed in capturing the criminals, they will hunt for the entire 6 months before the festival begins. The yokai, who has the desire to protect the human world and the power to do so, could use all the help they can get in this difficult time. That's why he wants to make Shiyun and Seol Hui a proposal. The qualification exam that was to be held in a month's time. It can be conducted in a slightly different format right now. They have to find and destroy the criminals that invaded Korea. This is the task before them. The next day, early in the morning, Yushin was walking to school. He was very sleep-deprived because he couldn't sleep a wink all night. He was thinking that he shouldn't have let Shiyun go. He shouldn't have agreed with his words and stayed. In his opinion, if that idiot didn't come back, the blame for his death would be entirely on Yushin. He decided to start acting much more decisively. As he was walking and thinking, he heard Shiyun addressing him, saying that his phone was turned off and he couldn't reach him. So he realized that he could meet him on his way to school. Shong asked if he had an extra minute, because after their conversation yesterday, a lot had changed and there was a lot to talk about. They arrived at the cafe, and Sion started telling the whole story to Yushin. The latter started reacting strongly to his story and asked him, "Sion, are you out of your mind?" The people in the cafe looked at them, and Sion felt uncomfortable. He asked Yushin to be quiet and not to yell at the whole cafe. Shiyun continued talking again and said that the conditions weren't bad in the least. It's the same that allows him to stay here instead of going back to the yokai world. And moreover, he won't have to make Yushin and his mom worry about him. Yushin lowered his head and asked if Shiyun knew what class of yokai he belonged to. Shiyun couldn't know such a thing, since he had only learned yesterday about the very fact that he was a yokai. Yushin explained to him that there are 5 categories: Shin, Ryung, Ki, Gui, Su. When Shiyun heard that, He immediately said that he hadn't heard that before, which gave him goosebumps, to which Yushin said that each of the 5 syllables denotes the status of a yokai. The lowest class is beast. Su comes from hancha, meaning beast, and is similar in meaning. Most of the yokev fall into this class. Though dangerous, these little things are not much different from wild beasts. Their strength is also small. Their strength is numerical advantage. Ordinary humans are quite capable of dealing with this species, even if they, unlike Yushin, can't use magic. There have been many such documented cases in the past. To a human with modern weapons, they pose no threat at all. The situation is different with the higher class yokai. They're no match for the average person. Gaoi, or monster. These are yokai who are as strong as 100 men. And by 100 people, they mean their combined physical strength. So in reality, even if 1,000 people pounce on him, only death awaits them. Shiyun listened so attentively and asked, since already these classes are the lowest, what do the yokai of the other 3 classes represent? Yushin replied that they represented disaster. He couldn't give him an exact answer because he hadn't met them yet. But roughly speaking, the key class was about 10 times stronger than the Gaoi class. If given a chance, they could turn a small town into a branch of hell on Earth in just one night. If we're talking about soul, that kind of yokai would leave one of its neighborhoods unscathed, and as for the Shin and Ryong class yokai, it was best not to go near them. Though Yushin felt that Shiyun would be safe from them. Those monstrous creatures rarely sought to break the law, so he advised him not to even think about taking part in the hunt. If that didn't work, he should call Yushin or come to him at once to lay low. If these yokai really came to Korea from other countries, they must be confident in their strength and ability to stand up to other yokai and shamans like Yushin. Yushin didn't know how many had arrived, but even if there was someone of the key class there, it should be fine. Shun dared to ask Yushin a question. Do you think that yokai who took the form of a snake? What class is he? Yushin replied that it was just a brat. He's clearly stronger than Su, but he's not as strong as Ki. According to the preliminary estimation, he's an average guhei. A much more powerful energy was felt by Yushin from the ghost he was controlling. If he was able to realize even half of the ghost's potential, then neither Yushin nor Shiyun would be alive. Besides, the yokai was using the ghost to distract Yushin's attention. If he hadn't realized the yokai's intentions right away, Shiyun would have been eaten by that bastard by now. Yushin had said that Shiyun's class was much lower than that yokai's. At best, he had an average or even weak goei. Really, he was a goblin, or wants to believe he is one. It didn't matter. There was no reason to get into trouble that you couldn't get out of. That was the advice Yushin gave him, and also added that, from an objective point of view, Zhong was a jerk. Even though Yushin wasn't being very polite, but he was obligated to bury these ideas of his right here and now. Afterward, Shiyun stated that if he were to fight that yokai right now, he would definitely be able to give him a beating. He also pointed out that without Yushin's help, he would have died there. But things were different now. He's learned how to use the yokai force properly. He also felt more confident in battle. Yushin sat and listened to him, realizing his way of thinking was good for nothing. After that, Shiyun noticed that he had distracted Yushin a lot, because now he was late for school. Yushin told him that he had no intention of going to school today. And judging from everything, in Yushin's estimation, Shiyun couldn't draw the right conclusions from yesterday's incidents, so it was his duty to help him out. He packed up and went to the Chamsil Olympic Stadium. This sports complex was built in 1986. It was built for the gymnastics competition of the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games. Now it is known as the largest concert hall and stadium of the Korean Sports Development Foundation, but it has another purpose that is not publicly advertised. Seong came to the underground floor. He didn't think there were such things there. On the way to this hall, they passed many of them. Seun wondered if they all belonged to Yushin's family. Yushin answered him that they weren't. The entire complex was funded by the government. Not all of the shamans belonged to his lineage, after all. Seun also wondered if the government knew about the yokai and the upcoming festival and so on. Yushin said that the government had always kept strong shamans around since ancient times, though rather, strong shamans once created the very concept of government. Because the power to stand up to monsters in that distant past was more than enough to rally the people around them. After all, 666 years ago, at the dawn of the Joseon dynasty, the threat of attacks from the yokai had disappeared. However, the imperial family established the Constellation Hall, an organization that nurtured new shamans. And the Yushin family is still carrying on this ancient duty. The yokai, the festival, the ghosts, the rulers passed on all this knowledge from generation to generation. Nowadays, however, only the highest ranks remember them, and even then, it doesn't look like they take the whole situation seriously. After that, Yushin told him that if he was ready, let him attack. He explained everything to him. There are no rules or time limit here. If he can defeat Yushin using his favorite methods available to him, he won't have to worry about being threatened by any of the yokai. Shion asked if Yushin was going to use the sword he had used to kill the yokai yesterday. Yushin wasn't going to use it, because that was the only way it would make any sense at all. Though shamans have their individual differences, but in general, usually a shaman who loses his weapon will be able to use less than half of his powers. Most are inseparable from their weapons and will not part with them under any circumstances. In Yushin's case, he can easily stand up to a Goe-class yokai with his bare hands. In other words, if Shiun managed to defeat Yushin, it would prove that he was stronger than the Goe class. Afterward, he addressed why he was standing, since he was the first one to attack. Xiong's hands were trembling and cold sweat was running down his face. After that, he immediately rushed to attack Yushin in the most basic way. He attacked him head-on, without any hidden attacks. Yushin wasn't too surprised and simply caught him on his approach. Throwing his punch aside, he threw his own punch at Shiun, causing him to fly off. But it didn't stop there. Yushin pushed himself off the floor and kicked him in the body, sending Shiun flying off to the other side of the room, leaving a long ditch in the floor behind him. The fact that Yushin did not ask if Shiun was all right was due to the pointlessness of the question. He realized everything the moment he was hit. Besides, he had already witnessed Shiun's regeneration abilities. Shiun stood up and said that Yushin was good at this matter. In addition, because his goal was to save his friend by bringing him to his senses, he didn't have to choose the means. However, the damage caused by Shiun was tending towards zero. Shiun noticed that it was as if Yushin was the protagonist of some manhwa. Yushin wondered if he had been hit harder by the blow Shiun had inflicted on him. He felt as if he had hit the wall with all his might with his fist. If he didn't concentrate enough energy around his fist, he would break every bone in his body. Shiun realized that he would be fine even if his friend stopped holding back, and Yushin, who realized how dangerous a yokai he was now up against. The conclusions they drew after the first attack were drastically opposite. Shiun went on the offensive, and instantly drew closer to try his luck again in a new attack. Yushin noticed that this time he was much faster than before, but his attack style hadn't changed at all. After that, Shiun grabbed Yushin's arm. Yushin was definitely not expecting this, so he dared to hit him from his knee to throw him off again. But what was his surprise when he realized that now this blow didn't go through and Xiong lifted him above him. Afterwards, Shiun saw Yushin reading a technique above him. The energy of the essence that fills the world, heed my request and become one with me. After that, Shiun let go of his hand and Yushin delivered a crushing blow with his magic and energy. The explosion was decent. Yushin turned to Shiun, calling him a fucking asshole. Asking for the thing in his hand, was it really what he was thinking? In his hands he held the goblin's cudgel. This was the first time he had managed to summon it of his own free will. At the moment, Xiong was not in the best condition. He still had plenty of physical stamina. The problem, however, was his spiritual energy. In the battle last night, Xiong had used up about 93% of his total energy reserve. The rarefied environment of the mortal world slows down the process even more. But ironically, the state of almost complete depletion of spiritual energy helped Seun recreate the circumstances under which he had managed to summon the Goblin Club the last time. Although his body was not under his control then, his senses and instincts were heightened, making him remember everything in great detail. It was a pitiful sight for Yushin, for he had read about the Goblins' Club in the ancient chronicles. Whether the people who had written them had exaggerated the merits of this weapon, or whether it was a matter of Seun, he didn't even know. But it didn't look or feel too impressive. Yushin didn't think the chroniclers were wrong. In an instant, Seun rushed to attack Yushin, already wielding a goblin club, swinging it properly. Xiong confirmed that the club looked much more formidable last time. Afterwards, he hit Yushin with a huge swing. He was left with scratches on his hands, which he used to cover himself with. Yushin thought that Xiong was much stronger than he looked, but by strengthening himself with spiritual energy, he definitely wouldn't lose to him. The strike was right after a long jump. It must have cost him a lot of energy. Yushin only needs to keep his distance. He can just keep defending until Seun is exhausted. But afterward, he saw the club stuck in the ceiling. Xiun didn't expect that either, but he thought it might work. Yushin immediately asked what he was up to, and why did he do it. It was obvious to Seun that it would be difficult for him in close combat, and it was also unlikely that he would be able to block that huge fist-like thing forever. Something Jun knows for sure. Right now, he wouldn't be able to use the same power he fought with last time. Neither the size nor the strength of the club. The output won't be half of that power, but a couple of the club's abilities are still available to him, shape-shifting and manipulating its movements to a certain extent. And of course, he's cunning enough to use them to their fullest. Shiyun swung his club and launched it at Yushin. It was more like a mace. Yushin once again held back the blow with his spiritual energy. It wasn't easy for Yushin to hold back such attacks. Shiyun pulled the club back and swung it even harder. Yushin saw this and realized what he had to do. He bounced away from this attack and jumped back as far as he could, and there was a powerful explosion where the mace flew. Yushin realized that he didn't see any change in its energy. Only its shape and manner of attack had changed, while its power had doubled. Afterward, he asked Seun if he was going to continue to play dirty like this. Shiyun answered him that it might not be completely fair, but he was the one who suggested sparring to determine whether he could match up with the other Yukai. And when fighting them, one should not avoid sneaky tricks. When you fight to survive, there's no point in thinking about honor. Yushin realized that Seun's arguments were so good that he had nothing to object to. Shiyun also added that Yushin had nothing to be ashamed of. Although the situation was atypical, after all, they were just two teenage friends. Afterwards, Shiyun suggested that Yushin admit that he was wrong. He suggested that he should repeat after him, "Sorry, Seun, I was wrong." In the same way, he continued, "Besides, it's true, isn't it? Yushin simply lacks ability, but there's nothing that can be done about it." Yushin heard this and said, "That's how it is." "Then there's no mercy." Shiyun decided to laugh at him and said he was scared. Then he struck where Yushin was standing and dodged it. He continued to make one attack after another. Even though Yushin had accelerated, it was getting harder and harder to dodge his attacks. He was starting to get used to his fighting style and attack speed, and quite quickly. But after that thought, Shiyun pulled his club a little differently. It was immediately clear to Yushin that this was a trick. The blow was able to be blocked, even though it was unpredictable. The explosion was very strong. At this moment, even Shiyun wondered if he had overdone it. Xiong looked into the thick of the smoke and asked if Yushin was okay. Shiyun's bludgeon stretched like a string. Shiyun realized that, of course, after changing the trajectory, the blow was weaker than the one he had taken earlier. But maybe he was already injured then? Yushin applied the technique. The consolation of the righteous, great goodness. The Lord is one that bears the time of the law. By the will of the law, I ask for equality. Willow arrow pierced the wicked. He launched his technique on this cudgel. It went straight through the cudgel into Seung. Xiong saw this and was about to take the hit. But what was his surprise that this arrow flew past and clipped the cudgel, which was stuck in the ceiling. From this turn of events, he flew downwards. Yushin threw the mace and rushed towards Seung, who flew down. But our hero pulled the mace to catch up with Yushin and hit him in the rear. Yushin managed to dodge it in time for it to fly past him. Looking at Shun, he began to recite a new technique, Moonlight Monarch Regalia, Changing Colors of the Scarlet Heavens. Right now, Yushin didn't have the ritual weapon with him, which aids him in using many techniques. The consequence stemming from this problem was the inability to use most of his techniques. In addition, even if he could use them, controlling them would be extremely difficult. Yushin continued to recite his technique. By the will of the law, I ask for equality. Recreate the sword of my homeland from his own spiritual energy. He recreated the weapon with the help of divine power. Sion had no choice but to attack him back. The surge of the two energies was a powerful explosion, with Yushin's blue energy being observed on one side and his best friend Sion's energy on the opposite side. Even though he had created this sword in a hurry, but against such overwhelming power, no Yukai could resist. Slashing the goblin's club and a moment before completing the strike, Yushin hesitated due to the fact that the opponent was his best friend. But for the same reason, he was able to find the strength to follow through. At this moment, Xion was already hitting him with his fist. And here is this spectacular picture of Yushin stabbing Seung with his sword, and he in turn strikes with his fist at Yushin. Yushin saw his sword go into Shiyun's body, and nothing happened, even though it should have. He couldn't even realize what had just happened, as the very same punch from Shiyun flew back at him. Shiyun didn't understand what had happened. Why, at the end of the fight, Yushin had succumbed to him. After all, he realized that if Yushin had injured him, he would have been able to recover quickly. Yushin told him that was not the case at all. He put all his strength into this technique. If his opponent was a Yukai, even if he was a Kai class, he would simply be cut in two, just like a goblin's club. But it's more likely that the tech itself recognized him not as a yokai, but as a human. After Yushin lay on the floor with a broken nose, he said, "You're an asshole, Shun." The next day, they were walking through town. Yushin had a band-aid on his nose to cover up the bruise Seung had left behind. He noticed Shun fidgeting around him with a worried look, and Ego was annoyed, so he told him to tell him what he wanted to ask. Seung, on the other hand, wanted to know if his friend's nose was hurting, and he was worried because his nose might be broken and then grow crooked. Yushin immediately told him that would definitely not happen. After all, even though he wasn't a Yukai, his body was hardened by countless training sessions. A broken bone and torn skin would heal in a day. Besides, Shion had, after all, reduced his punching power a moment before punching Yushin. Realizing that his ability didn't work, he weakened his attack as much as he could. If he didn't, Yushin's nose would have turned to mush. Yushin noticed that Shun wasn't bad at fighting, and since he felt like hanging around chasing monsters, he wouldn't stop him. But he also still didn't agree with his decision, but what could be done? A deal was a deal. Yushin also gave something to Shun. It was a pumpkin, but it was not an ordinary pumpkin. It would help Seung a lot in times of need. Yushin explained that they were a kind of roshodniki. He suggested they were analogous to a grenade. To activate them, all you have to do is clasp them in your hand and say Sawaha. If you're pressed for time, just throw them on the ground. With Seung's power, a slight squeeze of the vial will suffice. For the alchemical formula inside to activate, Yushin advised to only use them in truly dangerous situations, and never break more than one at a time. Shiyun thanked him, and asked if he could really accept them from him. After all, they contained Yushin's energy, an unimaginable amount of it. Making them, he realized, was not an easy task. Yushin didn't realize how he had figured it all out. He asked Seun if he had seen these things before, to which he received the answer that Seun had not seen them before, but when he touched them, he could feel the energy trapped inside. And it was the same energy he had felt during their battle. It was inside the pumpkins, a vast amount of it. Seon's hunch was correct. The three-colored gourds were Dharma storage devices used mainly by the Yushin family. Once the vial is coated with a special solution, it becomes capable of accumulating and storing the owner's energy when the owner chooses to pour it into the vessel. This allows shamans to use techniques that require huge amounts of energy at any time and regardless of the situation. Furthermore, even if it is not their own energy, anyone can use such a vial by releasing its contents. Yushin froze, and some speculation flew in his thoughts. After all, the solution covering the vessel seals the energy inside. Since he could feel its flow through such a barrier and even determine the amount of energy, after such speculation, Yushin asked to look at Seun's hands. Seun didn't understand what Yushin might be up to, but his friend knew that by the length and location of the lines on a person's palm, one could determine his fate and character. All of this, by itself, is utter nonsense. However, one can definitely recognize something from it. Yushin looked at Seun's hand, and his head was filled with thoughts again. He had never seen this before. Xiong didn't just have keen senses. He was a real talent. A person's predisposition to martial arts, or their potential to become a monk or shaman. He understood that chiromancy was not 100% accurate, but the fact that he could sense the energy within the three-colored vessels and his fighting style left no doubt. If Xiun wasn't a yokai, Yushin would immediately run to ask his father for permission. Not even that. In such a unique case, he wouldn't even need permission. With his talent, even if he became their apprentice without being from the clan, no one would even say a word. Yushin wondered if it was not too late. Even though hiding that he was a yokai wouldn't work, he was no doubt half human and his willpower. Although it won't work. No way those stubborn idiots would do such a thing. Except they wouldn't be given permission. With a huge chance the situation could be taken the wrong way. After all, he could be a goblin with the talents of a shaman. Honestly, if it wasn't Xiong, he himself would be looking at him askew. If only he had found out about this 3 days earlier. After these thoughts, Yushin told him that he was just thinking about how messed up his fate was. They continued on their way through the city, and Xiun was shocked. He didn't know that Yushin was able to figure it out just from his palm. Yushin answered him that maybe it was true, maybe not. Anyway, when does he plan on going to school again? Yushin inquired. Xiun could use a new uniform for starters, since he had nothing to wear besides that tracksuit, and he was thinner than before. He had a feeling that even the size of his feet had shrunk. Yushin couldn't wait to see the reaction of his classmates when he got to school. He wondered how many people would recognize him if he didn't say so himself. Xiun wasn't amused. He even got a headache at the mere thought of meeting his classmates. Yushin glanced at his phone and saw that it was already noon, and they still hadn't eaten yet. Xiun had offered to treat him to some cafe, but Yushin hoped that they would eat at Seun's house. Xiun had made him kimchi fried rice last time. It was delicious with pork. Xiun had to refuse because there was a bit of a problem with it. He had guests at home right now, and besides, they might still be asleep. Oh, and after lunch, Xiun had somewhere to look. Yushin realized that they wouldn't be at his house and asked him to stop looking for excuses. After all, he had told him before, whatever he was doing there with the yokai was none of his business. And since Xiun was so busy today, Yushin just went to school, but he also made a point to treat him next time. He also paid attention to the slumped Xiun, and encouraged him not to be late for the meeting. After all, Yushin knew that Xion was strong enough in spirit for the upcoming events. They split up, and Xion went to the meeting. He went into some neighborhood. It looked very old. Most of the houses were empty. Our hero even began to question if he had come to the right place. Xiong stumbled to the door and began to read what it said. He barely managed to read "Dark Moon Rising." There was very little knowledge of hieroglyphics. As he approached this door, it opened in front of him, and there stood a guy. Xion immediately noticed that this guy was a yokai, and a very strong one at that. He walked past, and Xion only looked at him. Then he was approached from the other door. "Goodness, who do we have here? A guest I've never seen before?" It was Horyun. She is the representative of the Dark Moon Rising. Xiong said hello and informed her that the judge told him about this place yesterday, gave him the address, and advised him to visit this establishment. She had heard about Xiun from the elder. Afterward, she asked to come with her. Xiong walked in and saw the inside of this place was unusually dark. It felt like there was some black fog everywhere. But after walking not much at all, he came out of that fog, and it opened up in front of him. Wonderful view. These buildings, how it all fit in here, like a tent in Harry Potter that you climb into, and there's a 2-story house. He was led to a table and tea was poured. They all sat down and began the tea party. Xiong thanked them for such hospitality and asked where they were, for it was hardly Seoul. There was delightful scenery and a slight breeze refreshing the guests. She confirmed the truth of his words and said that the House of the Dark Moon Rising was a space that existed apart from the human world. Since it had been isolated from civilization and progress for centuries, the pristine beauty of nature and fresh air had been preserved here until now. She also explained what this space exists for. Here, you could say, is a store providing various benefits to the UK to help them adapt to the human world. Old man Mangtae told him to go take a look at this place as soon as it dawned, but even if it's a store for the yokai. Just like that, he also remembered his scroll and immediately summoned it. He showed what the old man handed him, saying it was the currency of the yokai world. As he did, he also asked if he could use it in their store. Horion saw the coins that were called ghost faces, said he could buy something with them as well as exchange them for something. Some yokai take jobs in the human world, but most live off of exchanging the coins for the currency of the country they live in. She also added that if you exchange those currencies at the current rate for that nation, 1 yang would be roughly equal to 3 million won. Xion was shocked to hear the figure. He realized that at the age of 17, he had never had more than 72,000 won in his account in his life. Afterward, she offered to look at the items on offer. It was a spirit pill. It was the most popular item in front of him, and it accelerated the recovery of spiritual energy. Xion looked carefully at the pills. Horion continued her story, telling him that the environment of the human world was notoriously poor in spiritual energy. Even in the world of the yokai, regenerating energy is not a quick process. Therefore, here in the House of the Rising Dark Moon, according to their secret recipe, they combine many medicinal herbs from the yokai world into one pill, so that even in unfavorable environments where natural energy recovery is difficult, the yokai can solve this problem by simply absorbing the pill. Xion immediately said that he was taking them. He needed them. He also asked about the color of the packages. After all, they are supposed to characterize the difference in effectiveness. She confirmed it, said that pills of different classes are packed in different colored boxes. They are priced in the standard currency of the yokai world, nyangs. 1 coin can buy 10 silver, 3 gold, or 1 black box. The higher the grade of the pill, the stronger its effectiveness, energy recovery. So if Xiong wanted to recover all his energy as soon as possible, the black pill would help him best. That was Horyun's advice. Xiong thought about it and decided to take the black one. He also asked if he could use it right now. She said that he could use it now, but that it should take effect quickly enough by nightfall, which was true of pills of any class. As for the energy of the yokai, there are two important factors to consider when evaluating it: Needin size and energy absorption rate. Needin size represents the maximum amount of energy a yokai can store, and it increases with age and by eating other yokai. However, the ability to absorb energy, which determines how quickly a yokai will replenish energy by absorbing it from the environment and defeated enemies, is almost impossible to improve after birth. It depends more on talent and bloodline. Highly ranked yokai will be able to digest the black pill in somewhere around 3 to 4 hours. But for someone with the same level as Shiyun, even after a few days, he might still not be able to absorb even half of the pill's energy. That's what Horyun thought, but she wasn't lying. After all, by digesting even a tiny portion of the pill, he would be able to replenish his meager supply by tonight. Xiong swallowed the pill. According to Horyun's estimation, the black pill was excessive for Siyun right now. She alone would be enough to completely restore Siyun's energy 3 to 4 times. But they were wrong. As soon as he swallowed the pill, not even a few seconds later, everything sharply lit up and a huge explosion sounded. No one had expected such a turn of events, neither the merchants nor Sion himself. What a flawed judgment Horyun had. He was all dirty and sweaty, looking at Siyun with a horrified look and thinking that it couldn't be like this because he had just swallowed the pill. It had only been a few seconds. And in such a short period of time, he had absorbed so much energy that it caused an overload. Shiyun sighed heavily and said that it was only the 3rd day he had become a yokai. He realized that for a beginner like him, this pill was too powerful. Shiyun felt all 100%, or maybe even more of his yokai energy for the first time in his life. A few minutes earlier, in the same place where Shiyun was, another guest was being offered a drink. They had specially prepared this liquor for him. Upon hearing that he had decided to visit them, the guy was addressing young Master Yusom. He told him that the 6 different herbs of the Samdukon River gave it a special flavor. This guy, his name is Donan, he is a representative of the House of the Rising Moon. Yusom himself tasted the liquor and said it was not bad. The only thing that confused him was why Donan was pouring the liquor for him. He was very annoyed by it. He hoped that Horyun would come back to him soon, for she had promised to meet someone. He supposed that extending her hospitality was not in her plans. Donan tried to defend her by saying that she was only late because of a business meeting. After all, they had been warned in advance by the honorable judge that a special guest was to drop by today. Yusom tried to find out who this guest was, but Donan didn't know all the details, but he knew that this guest was a half-blood with goblin blood running through his veins. Yusom realized that it was that skank, and he was already on his imagination. The old man, of course, as usual, he could have just left that half-dead bloodline alone. Not only is he wasting his time on some half-breed, but he wants him to perform at the festival. He's hardly even a yokai, so how could he be at the festival? Yusom said, and noticed how Donan was suddenly quiet. He assumed that he was bored and tired of listening to him. But afterwards he realized that it was because he was also a half-UK, and his words might have hurt Donan a lot. He remembered his older sister telling him that they had held on to this tradition for over 1,000 years, accepting into their home all half-breeds who had nowhere else to go, ambiguous creatures who are incapable of becoming either human or yokai. They don't consider themselves human, and no one recognizes them as full-fledged yokai. So a bunch of half-breeds decided to create this place in an attempt to gain acceptance from society. In a way, it's a smart move. But even so, the day when other yokai recognize them will never come. Yusom asked him if he didn't think so himself. Donan answered him that they could not know the future, and then offered to pour more liquor, for the cup was already empty. Yusong realized that this guy was a merchant first and foremost, and he couldn't even be teased. Afterward, he asked when he could get out of here. Donin replied that the preparations would most likely be completed by today. They traded all of his ghost faces and took care of his legend and residence, which he would be able to use in the human world, just as he had requested. Everything is of exceptionally high quality. His wish to cross paths with humans as infrequently as possible was also taken into account. Yuson noticed that they were working much faster than he had expected. Donin replied that he had agreed to risk his life for the sake of the human world. Needless to say, they had made every effort. Yuson wasn't doing it for their sake. He was just annoyed with the situation. Some freaks from overseas decided to cause them a bunch of problems. Being the masters of the peninsula, they can't just let it go. But Yuson also had an ulterior motive. He wanted to contribute to the problem. He could raise the reputation of his clan. And then even his father would recognize him as worthy of participating in the festival. After all, he was as talented as his brother and sister. The only difference is that he was unlucky enough to be born 100 years too late. Now he has to get himself to be seen as a candidate. Then it is up to him to beat his sister and brother in this race at all costs in the next 6 months. Yunon asked Donin about a girl named Hor-Yong. Donin wanted to go and see if she could return immediately, but he was stopped by Yunon. After all, he would like to have more than just a drinking companion in her person. While he was in the human world, he would want her as a servant with him, and that he wouldn't think anything of it. He's not going to defile himself by associating with a half-breed, even if she is pretty, Yunon said, explaining that he doesn't have anyone to chat with at his leisure in the human world anyway. After all, he will not be round the clock chasing foreign upstarts. Rest is also necessary. Donin tried to tell the young master that they didn't provide such services. Yunon asked him, "Isn't he a merchant? Isn't he supposed to fulfill every request in every sense of the precious customer? That the customer should not be frustrated." So he ordered Dong-hoon to go and interject this information to Hor-Yong. Immediately after saying that, they heard a powerful explosion of energy. That was the explosion when Xiong took the black pill. It was very unusual for them as it had never happened here before. It quickly disappeared, and they sat there looking in that direction, not understanding what it was and why it happened. Here we will be explained what qi is. It flows inside everything like water. Living things, from its perspective, are like bowls in which it lingers briefly. Let different beings touch and utilize this energy in different ways. The principles behind it are the same for all, whether yokai or human. You can increase the size of your cup, of course, but you can't fill it with more energy than it can hold. To be honest, such an obvious principle didn't really need such a detailed explanation. Xion stood and looked at Hor-Yong, asking if she was all right, and it looked like he had created unnecessary trouble here. He also added that the pill was much more amazing than she had described. Xiong felt incredible sensations. He felt as if he could easily break mountains. However, for some reason, that obvious princeling didn't apply to Xion. Therefore, he absorbed all the energy in the pill. As Hor-Yong looked at Xion in horror, she heard someone ask, "What the hell is going on here?" It was Yunon, as he also said, "What an ill-mannered bastard. Only an idiot would throw energy around in a place like this. Since you don't know how to control it yourself, maybe I should teach you." Hor-Yong realized that a conflict was brewing. So she said that she was responsible for what was happening. The guest had nothing to do with it, and she asked her not to anger Mr. Yunon, but he told her to shut up. After all, in his opinion, he did not ask her and did not allow her to speak. Then he asked her if she thought he was an idiot. After all, he is sure that the energy he felt at the moment of the explosion came from Sion. Plus, he still hasn't realized the situation he's gotten himself into, and he keeps emitting it. Yunon thought that after the performance that Xiong had put on here, that he would just turn a blind eye to everything that he had put on here. Hor-Yong begged the Lord to have mercy. Xion, on the other hand, turned around and apologized, but it didn't end there. He said that he wasn't doing a very good job of controlling his energy yet. Sion stood out, even by human standards, for his politeness and calmness. Xiong didn't think something like this could happen. Therefore, he was very sorry if he caused any inconvenience. However, the Naden, filled to the brim for the first time, clouded Xiun's mind. Therefore, he continued his address to Juno, saying that even considering the current situation, didn't he think he was being too rude to someone he was seeing for the first time? At that moment, his yokai essence prevailed over his human nature. Yunnan was very angry at the remarks towards him, for how could he dare to say such a thing? Xion didn't stop there and said that he was really sorry for what happened, but calling him a scoundrel and such. "Shouldn't you be more polite?" Xiong asked Yuno. Yunnan was very angry at his words. After all, no one had ever spoken to him like that before, so he decided to use force against him, rather than continue the dialogue. With a powerful blow, Xiong was thrown from under the building to the outside. He flew off and exploded from the fall. Horian couldn't have believed this. After all, this shouldn't have happened. She didn't even know how to calm them down. Yunnan, after the attack, said that he was merciful and didn't direct his attack at his stupid head, but he better not overstep his bounds again. After all, in Yunnan's opinion, there is no question of a fight. He just wants to teach Xiun manners. He was sure that a rude brat like Xiun could use a couple lessons. Zhang stood up, but Yunnan used his attack on him again, aiming it directly at his head, causing him to receive an attack from under his head that hit him with the same force as the first time. Horian tried to calm the young lord down, telling him that violence was forbidden in the house of the Dark Moon Rising, no matter the circumstances. She didn't care how grateful their family was. If the head of the house found out about such an act, he wouldn't get off easy. After saying that, Yunnan attacked Horian as well, stabbing her 3 times with his attacks. He inflicted tremendous damage on her, making her feel very sick, and her condition deteriorated drastically. He stared at her and said that he had warned her that no one should overstep their bounds. Yunnan said, "I ghoulishly thought that of all these dogs, at least you had a drop of intelligence in you. But after all, you're only a half-breed, too." Horian tried to understand what had just happened, for she felt no energy, nothing at all. Something that the naked eye wouldn't be able to detect had suddenly materialized out of nowhere. She put it down to the unique techniques of the divine beasts from the Hathai clan. Yunnan turned to Xiong and said to him, "Look here, half-breed, and listen carefully if your ears aren't blocked. Come now and kneel down. I'll teach you manners instead of old Mang Tai." But Xiong didn't care about his words anymore. He too decided to teach him a lesson, asking him, "Showing off, huh? If you wanted to talk, you should have done it with dialogue from the beginning. Talking about manners after he attacks first." Clearly not an indicator of good manners, so Sion suggested he continue what he'd started. Yunnan agreed, since the guy was so desperate for death. He aimed his attack at Xiun, but what was his surprise after what he saw? Xiun immediately repelled all of his attacks and remained unharmed. Horian clearly didn't expect Xiun to be able to do such a thing. After fending off all of his attacks, Yunnan was shocked. This had never happened before in his life. Xiun turned to him. "What you threw at me was water, wasn't it? I may not be good at the basics, but it's just energy manipulation. It looks like you're launching water droplets at high speeds." After all, the first thing that hit Shun was probably tea spilled on the floor. It felt like he was hit by a truck, but the smell of tea was coming from his attack. He was convinced of his assumptions during the second attack. It was as if small drops of water had appeared in front of him, and judging from that, it seems that humid air and dewdrops are also suitable for using this magic. And if he understood it correctly, the farther the water travels, the more it hurts, probably due to the acceleration. It was certainly not an experience that Sion was proud of, but he had experienced a similar ability last night. And when you compare the two of them, Yuno is a small fish compared to him. These words struck and hurt Yunano deeply. Xion, with a smile on his face, said to him, I'm sorry if I offended your feelings," and immediately disappeared from where he was standing. Didn't he understand how this half-breed dared to talk like that? He had appeared in front of Yunnan in a very short time, and was already ready to strike him a blow. Xiong was angry at him for his rude behavior, so the blow he prepared was strong. Yunnan saw that Siyun was attacking with his right hand, and he decided that it was straightforward, it was pitiful to look at. The direction of the attack could be seen through the aura, too. Yunnan assumed that Siyun didn't know, so he had to practice and learn how to hide it. What was Yunnan's surprise when he missed hitting Xiun because he dodged in time? Xian had thought it would be too obvious a punch, so threw him another punch, which I assure you Yunnan would get an epiphany from. By hitting him straight into the body, he inflicted tremendous damage on this upstart. Xian realized how Yushin had anticipated all of his attacks and took advantage of it. But as it was, Yunnan missed that punch, and now he's on his knees before Siyun, unable to let down. But that's not the end of it.